Tonight, we open a door that smells of dust and candle wax. A corridor of stone leads to a room that was never meant for light. On a table, a leather folio trembles as if it remembers the hands that hid it. The room is already waiting. Keys turn. A folio slides free. Inside are pages the church kept close, not to thrill, but to protect. Visions that did not fit the homily, dates scratched out, names softened into symbols, not to deceive, to prevent panic. These writings speak in quiet tones, a city of 7 hills asleep under a red moon, a star that falls like bitter water, a shepherd who walks alone beneath a sky that does not answer. Not doom for drama's sake, but warnings about the human heart when fear grows louder than love. Why hide them? Because fear spreads faster than faith. Because a prophecy can become a script if repeated without wisdom. The Vatican learned this the hard way. Each age hears what it wants, not what is true. So they guarded fragments, edited margins, and placed the most troubling visions in sealed drawers, not erased, preserved, but out of reach. This book opens those drawers in a calm way. No shouting, no flashing sirens. We read, then breathe. We ask what the symbols meant to the ones who wrote them, and what they mean now after wars, plagues, eclipses, and the glow of new screens. We trace the keepers of these pages, monks, astronomers, confessors, and women who dreamed and were believed only in secret. What did the church fear? Not the end of the world as fire alone, but the end of meaning. The moment people stop listening for mercy and start counting only signs. These prophecies are mirrors. They show our hunger for certainty, our weakness for spectacle, and the narrow path that remains. Watch, repair, console, and choose hope even when the sky darkens. We begin where the candles still burn. The drawer was not golden, it was not even ornate, just plain wood darkened by centuries of hands, its keyhole worn smooth by men who swore oaths never to speak of what they read inside. When it opened, the sound was dull, almost tired, as though the hinges themselves remembered the weight they carried. Inside, wrapped in linen that had frayed to dust, were pages that breathed unease. Not because of demons, not because of curses, but because words, once set loose, do not return. These words were visions, not neat sermons, not clear predictions, fragments, jagged as broken glass. A woman in Siena dreaming of fire over the sea. A monk in Krakow who wrote of blood pooling in chalices. A shepherd in Spain who swore the moon spoke his name. They did not align, these fragments. They contradicted, they echoed, they warned, and above all, they unsettled. The Vatican did not erase them. It placed them here, in drawers marked non-legenda, not to be read. The idea was not suppression for power's sake, but stewardship. Fear spreads quickly, faster than prayer. A whisper of apocalypse is enough to send a village running into the fields, abandoning hearths, children, duties. So, the drawer became a quiet tomb for words. Still, some priests read them. Some copied phrases into margins of safer texts. One note survives. These words trouble the heart, but must not be lost. Someday they will be needed. That is the paradox. To hide a prophecy is to preserve it. It becomes seed in the soil, waiting. And so the drawer remained. In its silence we learn something. The church feared not only the end of the world, but the world that might end too early in the imagination of the faithful. A world burned not by fire, but by panic. The locked drawer whispers, patience. Not every vision must be shouted from pulpits. Some must wait for centuries, until ears are steady enough to hear them. The manuscripts that survived carry more than main text. Their true life lies in the margins. Small hands, cramped letters, written in ink that has faded into rust. These were not official proclamations. They were notes from weary scribes, copying late into the night by candlelight. And sometimes, when the words unsettled them, they dipped their pens and left warnings in the edges. One such manuscript speaks of a city covered in ash, The prophecy is vague, but the margin note is clear, best not read aloud. People will think of Rome, they will fear without cause. The main text is scripture, plain and holy. The margin is where fear breathes. Another shows 3 blood moons drawn above crude sketches of men kneeling. Beside it, a small comment, symbol only, not literal, dangerous if taken so. That word dangerous repeats across many margins. Dangerous, not because it is false, but because it is too easily misread. The Vatican learned from these margins. They became the caution tape across apocalyptic writing, a way for those who copied to confess their unease, and for later readers to tread carefully. Red ink, often scarce, was chosen not for drama, but for visibility in low candlelight. If you were tired, if your mind blurred letters, the red margin would still speak. Slow down, be careful, do not take too quickly. These notes tell us something about the soul of the church. It did not always roar from pulpits. It whispered through margins. It prayed through pauses. It trusted that fear is a fire, and small warnings can keep sparks from leaping into fields of dry straw. In reading them now, centuries later, we do not find sensational secrets. We find the trembling hand of a man who knew that words could wound as much as heal. The prophecy warned of stars falling. The scribe warned of men falling faster if they believed too soon. The margins in red are not decoration. They are the hidden dialogue between text and heart, between vision and caution. They are as prophetic as the prophecies themselves. Rome rests on 7 hills. Every child in the city knows the names: Aventine, Palatine, Esquiline, words older than the empire, whispered into poems, songs, maps. The hills are not dramatic. They are gentle slopes, carrying trees, houses, piazzas. Yet, in the prophetic imagination, they rise larger than mountains. One recurring vision speaks of a city on 7 hills that burns, then rises, then burns again. For some, it was Rome. For others, any city built on 7 stones. The prophecy became a mirror. People saw what they feared most. In one century, it was invaders at the gates. In another, it was plague carried on wind. Later still, bombs falling like hail. The Vatican archivists kept these texts folded carefully. They knew the risk. To say Rome will burn is to set minds alight. To say the hills will tremble is to give fuel to enemies waiting for weakness. So the dreams were not erased, they were held, shown only to a few who were told, this is symbol, this is not map, do not mistake it for calendar. One copy survives with a sketch of the hills, each marked with a torch above it. In the margin, the note, 7 sins, not 7 stones. Here lies the wisdom. The prophecy may not have spoken of geography at all. The 7 hills became symbols of pride, greed, lust, envy, wrath, gluttony, and sloth. A city on 7 hills was not Rome only, but any heart built on these foundations. Thus, the dream becomes less about destruction, more about warning. When your inner city is built on such hills, it will burn, and it must burn if it is ever to rise again. The 7 hills prophecy was feared not because it told of Rome's ruin, but because it told of everyone's ruin. If taken literally, it was doom for one place. If taken symbolically, it was doom for all. And that is heavier still. So the church kept the dream in drawers, spoke of it carefully, and waited for generations who might hear it, not with panic, but with humility. For the hills are still there, both in Rome and in us. Quiet, sloping, waiting for what we build upon them. The parchment should have spoken with clarity. A year, a day, an hour, etched in ink, so there would be no doubt. But the lines falter, the numbers blur. Some are scratched out entirely, replaced with smudges of ash-coloured ink. It looks careless, almost accidental, until you see how often it occurs. Date after date, century after century, the years fade while the visions remain. The Vatican never feared prophecy as much as it feared calendars. A vision of fire or flood is unsettling, but it lingers in imagination. A vision tied to a date becomes a ticking clock. People sell possessions. They abandon work. They gather on hillsides, eyes fixed on the horizon. And when the day passes, hope collapses into anger, anger into despair. Faith itself begins to unravel. So dates disappeared, not erased entirely. Some copies preserved them in secret, but blurred, softened, swallowed into phrases like soon or in the fullness of time. The scribes who did this were not deceivers. They were protectors. Their task was to steady the faithful, not feed panic. One monk in the 12th century wrote of a red dawn when the shepherd shall fall. In the first draft, he had marked the year with precision, but in the surviving copy, the year has been washed with water, leaving only a pale shadow of numbers. The margin carries a note, "Best leave to God's hour." That small sentence holds centuries of wisdom. A prophecy is not a train schedule, it is a mirror. If you stare at dates, you miss the meaning, and yet some still searched. Pilgrims whispered numbers in marketplaces. Fortune tellers leaned on blurred texts, as if they were fresh revelations. When the year failed, they found new numbers. In this cycle, the church saw not faith, but fever. To heal it, they chose silence. But silence has its own weight. The absence of dates made the prophecies timeless, able to echo into every generation. A vision without a year never expires. It hovers, ready to attach itself to whatever crisis is near. A plague, a war, a famine, a comet. Each era hears the words as though they were meant for them. Perhaps this is what the scribes intended. Perhaps prophecy was never about pinpoint accuracy, but about timeless wakefulness. When dates disappear, panic loses its sharp edge. But so does certainty, and certainty is what people crave most when the world trembles. This tension between the need for guidance and the risk of frenzy was what the church carried in those blurred lines. To this day, the prophecies whisper not when, but always, and perhaps that is the point. The end is not scheduled. The end is every day. We choose despair over hope, fear over love, silence over prayer. The missing dates do not erase the warnings. They sharpen them. They ask us not to count years, but to weigh hearts. And that is the truest calendar of all. In candlelit chambers, the role of censor was not thunderous. There were no bonfires of books, no torches raised to the night sky. Instead, there was a man seated at a table, quill in hand, moving slowly line by line. He was called not destroyer, but corrector. His work was simple: to guard the flock from panic disguised as prophecy. The word censor today tastes harsh, like iron in the mouth. But in its earliest sense, it meant one who weighs, one who judges carefully. The quiet censor in the Vatican archives did not shout condemnations. He underlined words. He crossed out excess. He tucked manuscripts into folders labelled sub secreto for secret use. He was less executioner, more shepherd. His task was to prevent dangerous words from scattering the flock. Dangerous words were not always false words. Some were too true, too raw. A vision of famine in a time of plenty could breed greed. A warning of schism spoken too loudly could cause the very split it feared. The quiet censor recognized this paradox. Prophecy can create the future it dreads. By softening a phrase, by shelving a book, he kept the world from rushing headlong into self-fulfilling ruin. One surviving letter describes the role. To preserve is holy, to destroy is sin, but to preserve unwisely is to wound. Therefore, weigh each word as you would a flame in dry grass. The censor was not erasing, but containing. He believed words were fire, and paper was the only hearth that could hold them safely. In the silence of his chambers, he faced questions that echo even now. How much truth can a soul bear without breaking? When does revelation guide, and when does it crush? He made choices line by line, trusting that God would forgive both omission and inclusion. The people never knew his name. They knew only that certain visions were never read from pulpits, never preached in open air. Instead, those words remained in drawers, behind locks, under wax seals. The censor carried the burden of deciding that the flock's peace was more urgent than the thrill of secret knowledge. Centuries later, the world condemns censorship as fear, but in those stone halls it was mercy, a way to let faith grow slowly, without being scorched by visions too heavy to carry. The quiet censor may not have been a prophet, but he was a guardian, and his red pen may have saved more lives than his silence ever betrayed. There are scrolls in the archives marked with wax, their seals unbroken for centuries, not because the words inside are forbidden forever, but because they were declared sealed for a season. This phrase repeats often in the catalogues. It means not destroyed, not revealed, only held until the world is ready. The church believed time itself could be a remedy. What terrifies one generation may guide another. A vision of plague might paralyze a city that has never known disease, but become wisdom to a people who already suffer it. A dream of fire might sound like doom to farmers in peace, but like reassurance to soldiers in war that destruction has meaning, that renewal is possible. So the Vatican practiced patience. Prophecies were read, weighed, and if too sharp, they were sealed. Not discarded, not burned, waiting. The seal was a covenant of trust. Trust that God would appoint the right hour for the words to breathe. One prophecy speaks of a black river swallowing stars. For centuries it was sealed. When finally opened, readers recognized it not as doom, but as metaphor for human doubt, the tide of unbelief that swept through an age of skepticism. In its time, the prophecy was not panic, but poetry, a call to hold faith against the currents. Another vision, of 3 nights without light, lay sealed until solar eclipses could be explained by science. Before that, it would have caused fear too great. After, it became a reminder of cycles, of the strange beauty hidden in shadow. The act of sealing is more profound than erasing. To erase is to deny. To seal is to admit the truth, but to wait for understanding. It is the humility to say, these words are not for us, but for those who will come after. The seals themselves became symbols, red wax, pressed with rings of shepherds, holding not just parchment, but possibility. Every unopened seal is a reminder. Revelation is not always instant. Some truths unfold across centuries. Some warnings bloom only when the soil of history is ready to receive them. And so the drawers remain, filled with sealed pages. Perhaps some are still waiting, their hour not yet come. They remind us that time itself is part of prophecy, not just the visions, but the waiting. Not just the warning, but the trust that God decides when the words will walk again among the faithful. To seal for a season is to believe in patience stronger than fear. It is to say, we do not need every answer now. Some wisdom belongs to tomorrow. And until tomorrow comes, we keep the drawer closed, the wax unbroken, the words safe in silence. The visions often spoke of fire, not the gentle flame of a candle, not the hearth that warms a family in winter. Fire in prophecy was a force with 2 faces, one that destroys and one that purifies. The problem, always, was that readers did not know which fire the words described. When a monk wrote of flames consuming cities, was it judgment or renewal? When a nun dreamed of fire sweeping the sky, was it punishment or healing? The church feared how easily the first meaning overshadowed the second. People hear fire and think only of wrath, punishment, apocalypse. But in the scriptures, fire is more than doom. It is the burning bush that does not consume. It is the tongues of Pentecost. It is the hearth of purification, where dross is melted and gold shines brighter. Prophecy never clearly separated one from the other, so scribes left notes, adding words like ignis probans fire, that tests, or ignis puniens, fire that punishes. In their margins, they tried to help readers know the difference. One prophecy described a fire crossing oceans. Many feared it spoke of war, ships aflame, cities reduced to ash. But one censor suggested it meant something else, the fire of faith, spreading not through destruction, but through light carried on waves. And yet, the same vision could mean both, depending on the heart that read it. That was the danger. To those who lived in constant fear, fire meant doom. To those who lived in constant hope, fire meant refining. The same text could either crush or comfort. That is why the church hesitated to release them openly. To tell a hungry village that fire was coming might push them into despair, but to share the same vision with monks in retreat could inspire them to deeper prayer. Two kinds of fire. The tension remains. Humanity wants one meaning, simple and sure, but prophecy refuses simplicity. It stretches us into paradox, where destruction and rebirth walk hand in hand. The scribes did not always resolve the puzzle. Sometimes they left the words untouched, letting the future decide which fire was meant. Even now, reading them centuries later, the ambiguity burns. Is the world ending or beginning again? The answer depends not on the prophecy, but on the heart that hears it. That is the truest secret of fire. It reveals, more than it foretells, the state of the soul gazing into the flame. Among the most troubling visions were those of a solitary shepherd. The image recurred across languages and centuries. A figure dressed in white, walking alone through ruined streets. No flock to follow, no voices to answer. For some, it was a symbol of the Pope, abandoned in crisis. For others, it was every leader who must carry burdens without companions. The church read these words carefully, fearing what they might inspire. One manuscript told of a shepherd weeping beneath a sky without stars. Another spoke of a voice in Rome, crying but unheard. These were not dramatic earthquakes or fiery plagues. They were quieter, more devastating. They suggested not the collapse of earth, but the collapse of unity. What happens when the shepherd speaks and the flock no longer listens? The church worried that releasing such visions might weaken confidence in papal authority. If people expected abandonment, they might create it themselves. So these pages were often sealed, sometimes annotated with soft warnings. A vision, not decree. Pray, do not predict. The scribes tried to soften the despair by framing it as allegory, a symbol of Christ himself, carrying the cross in loneliness. Yet the unease remained. Some accounts show how this vision echoed in times of schism. During years when rival claimants to the papacy divided Christendom, readers found in these prophecies confirmation of their worst fears, that the shepherd had indeed been left alone. Later generations linked the image to persecution, imagining popes hiding from invading armies or walking nameless among the poor. Always, the solitary shepherd stood as a mirror for the anxieties of the age. But there is another reading. Loneliness does not mean failure. It can mean faith carried into silence, a leader who keeps walking even without applause. In this sense, the prophecy was not doom, but a reminder that the shepherd must sometimes walk first, bearing solitude as part of his office. His strength comes not from numbers around him, but from endurance. The danger, of course, was that despair might eclipse this gentler meaning. And so, once again, the church chose silence. Better to guard the image in drawers than to risk entire flocks stumbling at the thought of an abandoned shepherd. The irony is that the very act of hiding the words left later readers with the same feeling of solitude. The shepherd alone is not only the Pope, it is the reader too, turning pages in secret, wondering why these words were never spoken aloud. The prophecy becomes truth not only in its image, but in its treatment. Isolation speaks across centuries, reminding us that sometimes the greatest trial is not disaster, but silence. Among the drawers of parchment, one category stands out: letters drafted but never delivered. They were addressed to bishops, to abbots, sometimes even to kings. Their tone is pastoral, sometimes stern, urging caution against apocalyptic fervour. Yet, for reasons we can only guess, these letters were never sealed with wax or carried by messenger. They remained in files, shadows of intentions, ghost voices that never reached their flocks. One such letter warns against the fever of dates, urging clergy to discourage obsession with timelines. The draft ends with a simple appeal: teach patience, not panic. But no bishop received it. Did the Pope reconsider, fearing it might draw more attention to the very prophecies it sought to calm? Or did events change so quickly that the words no longer fit? We cannot know. Another letter, addressed to a monastery, speaks of visions of famine. The draft advises, tell the brothers to store grain, not fear, practical, measured advice. Yet the letter was never sent. The margin bears only the note, held in reserve. Reserve for what? Perhaps the famine never came. Perhaps it did, and the monks endured without the letter. The parchment testifies to an intention unfulfilled. These unsent letters reveal something profound. The Church did not only censor by cutting or sealing. Sometimes it censored by silence, choosing not to speak when speech itself might create the panic it wished to prevent. Words once sent cannot be recalled. A shepherd's warning might stir a flock to safety or stampede them into chaos. Better, sometimes, to let the letter rest in drawer and trust that God's providence would guide without it. And yet, silence has consequences. Generations later, readers find these drafts and wonder what might have changed if they had been read aloud. Would panic have been avoided? Would lives have been saved? Or would the warnings have sparked the very fear they feared? The paradox lingers. There is a haunting intimacy in these letters. They are written with care, with pastoral concern, as though the writers were already speaking to their audiences. But then the voice stops, mid-sentence, mid-blessing. They are conversations interrupted before they began. In the end, the letters never sent are prophecies in themselves. They teach us that sometimes the hardest choice is not what to say, but whether to speak at all. And in that hesitation, in that silence, we glimpse the deep caution of the Church, that words about the end of time must be weighed not only for truth, but for their power to shape the hearts that hear them. The drawer holds the unsent letters like bottled messages, never cast into sea. They remind us that prophecy is not only in what is spoken, but in what remains unspoken. The silence between words can be just as heavy as the visions themselves. It was not a map in the way sailors carried maps. No rivers traced in blue, no mountains shaded in brown. Just a parchment folded carefully into squares, covered with lines that curved like vines, crossing and looping until they looked less like geography and more like a dream. Some said it charted the world's end. Others said it was only metaphor, but all agreed it was dangerous. The folded map appeared in more than one archive. Always the same pattern, circles within circles, 7 paths converging into one. At the centre, a mark shaped like a cross. Around it, words scratched in Latin, Viae ad consummatianum, roads to the consummation. But consummation of what? The world, the Church, the human soul? The Vatican kept the map in a drawer because it frightened people. To see roads drawn so clearly gave the impression that history itself was plotted, that every war and famine was only another step toward the final centre. Worse still, readers began looking for their own towns in the curves, imagining themselves near the end, convinced their own time was the final hour. The map turned symbols into coordinates, and coordinates inspire panic, but to the careful eye, the lines do not match the Earth's geography. They match something deeper. They resemble the pilgrim paths carved into cathedral floors, labyrinths meant for meditation. The folded map was not meant to predict, but to invite, a guide for the inner journey, not the outer world. Yet the temptation to read it literally was too strong. People want charts, not metaphors. They want to know where they stand, how far until the end. The scribes added notes in the margins, not for travel, not for the body, but the soul. Still, the map whispered otherwise. Its folds suggested secrets, its lines suggested destination. The more it was hidden, the more people imagined it must reveal the exact hour of apocalypse. The truth may be simpler. The folded map is a mirror of human desire to control what cannot be controlled. The end is not plotted on parchment. It is lived. Each day we choose despair over faith, violence over peace. The roads do not lead outward, they lead inward, to the cross at the centre of every human heart. That is where the consummation waits. But the map remains folded, because once unfolded in public, it will always be misread. Better to keep it closed than to watch panic race down roads that were never meant to exist. Among the most whispered prophecies was the vision of 3 days without light. The idea appears in scattered manuscripts, skies darkened, candles struggling, people huddling in silence. Some believed it foretold volcanic ash, others solar eclipse, others supernatural wrath. The church called it simply Tres Dies Tenebrarum, 3 days of darkness, and they feared what it might do if preached too openly. The problem was not the vision itself, but the rule that grew around it. Copies of the text often carried instructions: stay indoors, light no fire, pray ceaselessly. Some even listed which prayers would be most effective, which saints to call upon, how to seal windows. The prophecy became less like a vision and more like a manual for survival. And manuals inspire obsession. Peasants stored food, built shutters, tested candles. Whenever the sun dimmed from dust storms or eclipses, panic spread. People locked doors, convinced the 3 days had begun. Some even refused to bury the dead, believing that the end was hours away. Faith turned into paralysis. Hope froze into fear. The Vatican knew the danger. They annotated the manuscripts, symbol only, not calendar. They tried to remind readers that darkness has always been a metaphor in Scripture. Darkness of the soul, not of the sky. 3 days was not astronomy, but theology. A reflection of the 3 days Christ lay in the tomb. The message was resurrection, not ruin. But not all wanted to hear it. Still, some priests used the prophecy wisely. They preached it as comfort. When your life feels swallowed in shadow, remember it lasts only 3 days. Dawn comes, light returns. The rule of 3 days became less about survival kits and more about endurance. But for every calm preacher, there were others who leaned into the fear, warning their flocks to prepare for cosmic night. That tension endures even now. The prophecy of 3 days reveals how easily people bend visions into instructions, how quickly mystery becomes rule. The church guarded the text not because it was false, but because it was too easily turned into superstition. Perhaps the real lesson is this: darkness, however deep, is temporary. The tomb becomes empty, the sun rises. 3 days is not about disaster, but about the rhythm of despair and hope. Every heart endures its 3 days of shadow. Every heart waits for its dawn. That is the prophecy worth keeping. It was not the comet. It was not the plague. It was not even the wars that frightened the church most. What they feared, above all, was hysteria. The collective fever that spreads faster than fire, faster than famine, faster than any army. Panic is contagious, and prophecy can be its spark. The archives are filled with warnings, not against falsehood, but against frenzy. Monks wrote of villages emptying overnight because a wandering preacher declared the end had come. Bishops recorded markets collapsing when rumours spread of stars falling from heaven. Even kings trembled when their people, convinced by prophecy, refused to obey. Chaos, not catastrophe, was the real danger. The Vatican learned this lesson in bitter seasons. One historian noted, "The prophecy does not kill, the panic it stirs does," and so they grew cautious. Better to seal a page than to see a city fall into madness. Better to hold silence than to feed hysteria with words too easily twisted. This was what was feared most. Not the end of the world, but the end of meaning. When people stop listening for truth and chase only signs, the faith itself fractures. Prophecy becomes performance, symbols become spectacles, and the heart of the message, repentance, hope, endurance, vanishes in the smoke. Even today, when the old prophecies surface online or in books, the pattern repeats. Readers rush to timelines, fixate on disasters, argue over which event matches which line. Few stop to ask what the vision asks of their souls. Few see that the prophecy is less about fire and more about fidelity. The church feared this forgetting. They feared that the faithful would seek excitement instead of wisdom, terror instead of trust. And so the drawers remained locked, not because the visions were false, but because they were too easily misused. In truth, the greatest prophecy is this: panic destroys faster than plague, fear devours meaning, and hysteria is the fire we ignite ourselves. That was what was feared most in the stone halls of the Vatican. Not the end of the world, but the end of listening. The first bell rang before the shadow touched the Sunday. It rang because fear moved faster than light. Villagers gathered in the square, eyes lifted, mouths tight, watching as the sky dimmed. The eclipse crept slowly, but the panic rushed quickly. Candles were lit, prayers whispered. Mothers pulled children indoors, as though walls could stop the moon from crossing the Sunday. For centuries, eclipses carried the weight of prophecy. Ancient manuscripts spoke of darkened skies as signs of judgment. Later ones repeated the theme: a noon that feels like midnight, a world wrapped suddenly in shadow. To the faithful, such moments seemed to confirm what had been whispered in drawers: the world could change in an instant. The Vatican watched closely. Priests were instructed to ring bells during eclipses, not to stir panic, but to steady it. The sound of bells was familiar, grounding. While the sky betrayed them, the church reminded them of order. One chronicler noted, as the light faded, the bells rang steady. The people looked less to the sky and more to the steeple. Fear broke, prayer remained. Still, some saw more than astronomy. They swore they glimpsed figures in the darkened disk, crosses in the corona, angels standing guard at the rim of the Sunday. To these imaginations, prophecy felt fulfilled. The church walked a careful line, acknowledging the awe, but reminding the people that eclipses had patterns, cycles, reasons. To let them remain pure mystery was to risk frenzy. To explain them fully was to risk stripping them of meaning. So the bells became the middle path. Not denial, not frenzy, but rhythm. A sound that tied heaven's shadows to earth's steadiness. The eclipses still came, and people still trembled, but the bells carried them through. The prophecy was not in the darkness itself, but in how the faithful endured it. The archives tell of one eclipse when clouds veiled the sky and the people never saw the shadow. Still, the bells rang. They rang not because of what was seen, but because of what was feared. That is the power of sound, to remind the soul that even in sudden darkness, order endures. And perhaps that was the truest prophecy of eclipses, not that they warned of endings, but that they taught humanity how to stand still in shadow and wait for light to return. On certain nights, the moon rose red, swollen like an ember hanging above the earth. Farmers paused mid-step, children pointed, old women crossed themselves. The blood moon has always been a stage for prophecy, a canvas where imagination paints fear. Scripture itself spoke of the moon turning to blood, so every red horizon carried a whisper of apocalypse. In villages, rumours spread faster than the tide. Some swore that blood moons foretold war, others that they meant plague. A few even insisted they were warnings of the final judgment. At such times, churches filled, not with steady prayer, but with trembling voices, people begging to know if the end had begun. The Vatican approached blood moons with caution. They knew the danger of silence, but also the danger of too much speech. So they taught their priests to answer calmly, "Bread remains bread." The Mass continues. Do not fear the colour of the sky. During one blood moon in the 17th century, a bishop wrote, "We broke bread at the altar, while the moon burned red outside. The people trembled, but the bread tasted the same." That was the Church's answer, not denial of the spectacle, but grounding in the ordinary. When the moon turned red, the faithful were reminded that life continued, that sacraments did not shift with the sky. Blood moons could not alter bread, nor stop grace. The constancy of ritual was stronger than the colour of the heavens. Yet the fear remained. Manuscripts in the archives reveal sermons never delivered, sermons warning that the blood moon was a herald of purification. Some were too sharp, too likely to stir frenzy, so they were kept in drawers. Better silence than hysteria. The Church chose bread over spectacle, constancy over drama. Still, the image of a red moon lingered in the imagination. It is too striking to vanish. Even today, people see it and wonder what it means. Perhaps it is both, a reminder of the fragility of the world, but also of the endurance of the ordinary. The moon may glow red, but bread remains plain. Prophecy may tremble in the sky, but faith continues on the altar. That is the paradox. The Church preserved, the world shakes, the heavens flare, but grace endures in small, steady ways. The blood moon prophecy teaches less about endings and more about anchors. When the sky changes colour, remember the taste of bread, remember the constancy of prayer. The apocalypse is not only in the sky, it is also in the soul that forgets the ordinary while staring at the extraordinary. That is why the Church spoke softly. That is why they taught plain bread, even under a red moon. Among the most troubling visions is the star called wormwood. It appears in Scripture as a burning star falling from heaven, poisoning rivers, turning waters bitter. In the archives, the word repeats across centuries. Some manuscripts describe it as a comet, others as a meteor, still others as a symbol of corruption. But always the tone is heavy. Wormwood was not just a star. It was bitterness itself, seeping into the heart of creation. The Vatican read these words carefully. If taken literally, wormwood inspired dread of cosmic catastrophe. People feared the sky would rain fire, that rivers would poison, that thirst itself would become death. But if taken symbolically, the vision pointed inward to the bitterness of the human soul, the corruption of leaders, the poisoning of trust. Both readings carried weight. Both carried danger. In some eras, wormwood was linked to famine. The bitterness of water became the bitterness of empty tables. In others, it was tied to heresy, teachings that poisoned faith like tainted wells. One marginal note reads, "The star is not stone but sin. It falls into hearts, not rivers." That line alone may explain why the Vatican feared the prophecy it condemned, not the sky, but humanity itself. And people resist such mirrors. The prophecy was sealed more often than spoken. Priests were discouraged from naming wormwood in sermons. To speak of poisoned rivers could spark panic among villagers who relied on every well. To speak of poisoned souls could spark division among those quick to accuse neighbours. The word itself carried too much weight, yet silence could not erase it. The star lingered in the imagination. Every comet in the sky, every bitter harvest, every poisoned well revived the memory of wormwood. Fear spread without the Church's voice, because prophecy once whispered cannot be fully contained. What does wormwood mean? Perhaps both things. The cosmos is fragile, stars fall, rivers sour, but so is the heart. Bitterness poisons from within as surely as any star from above. The prophecy's danger lies not in its prediction, but in its dual edge. It threatens both body and soul. The Vatican feared wormwood because it named something they could not control. They could calm hysteria over eclipses with bells, soften blood moons with bread. But bitterness is harder to cure. It seeps quietly, corrupting faith, dividing families, eroding trust. A poisoned heart is more dangerous than a poisoned river. That is the secret wormwood reveals. The prophecy endures, not as a countdown to catastrophe, but as a mirror to human condition. Every generation sees its own bitterness reflected in the star: wars, betrayals, hatreds. The taste of wormwood is never far from human lips. That is why the Church sealed the words, not because they were false, but because they were too true, too close, too dangerous to name without stirring unrest. And so wormwood waits, written in ink and hidden in drawers. But it does not need parchment to exist. It falls into every heart that clings to bitterness, every word spoken with venom, every silence kept in resentment. The prophecy is already fulfilled, again and again. Each time water turns bitter in the soul, the star falls nightly, the rivers sour in secret, and the only cure is mercy, the only antidote forgiveness. That is what wormwood whispers, not doom from above, but the danger already here, already flowing in us. The prophecy warns not of skies collapsing, but of hearts refusing to soften, and that may be the darkest vision of all. The ancients called them wanderers, lights that refused to hold still. While the fixed stars stayed in their lattice of constellations, these few moved slow, deliberate, shifting night by night. Planets, we call them now, but in the centuries, when prophecy grew, they were signs, omens, voices of heaven writing across the black sky. Manuscripts in the Vatican archives speak of them with reverence and fear. Mars, glowing red, was the warrior star. Jupiter, bright and steady, was a kingly light. Venus, rising before dawn, was a herald. When these wanderers drew close together, people trembled. They believed that heaven itself was rearranging, announcing shifts in the world below. The Church knew the danger. A conjunction of wandering stars might pass unnoticed by scholars, but to villagers it was apocalypse written above. Wars would be expected, kings would be toppled, famine would be assumed. Fear had no shortage of fuel when planets wandered. Priests had to speak carefully, neither denying the wonder nor confirming the dread. Jesuit astronomers later charted these movements with precision. They built instruments, drew tables, and showed that the wanderings had rhythm, that nothing was random. But even their calculations could not erase the awe. People saw patterns beyond math. They felt meaning, not mechanics. And prophecy thrives on meaning. One parchment in the archives records a prophecy of two wandering lights, embracing, and the world trembling. To some, it meant the rare conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. To others, it meant two rulers joining in war. The Church filed the parchment under caution. Its words could ignite panic faster than they could guide prayer. Yet, not all readings were dark. Some saw in the wanderers reminders of the Magi, guided by a star to the place of birth. A wandering star, then, could lead not to war, but to revelation. The Vatican leaned into this softer meaning, choosing to remind the faithful that even when lights cross in strange ways, God may be guiding, not destroying. Still, the temptation to link every wandering star with catastrophe was too strong. Each conjunction became a mirror of fear, each orbit a prophecy fulfilled. The Church sealed many such texts, worried not about astronomy, but about hysteria. The wandering stars could not be stopped, but their words could be softened, hidden, delayed. What the archives show is this: prophecy is less about the stars themselves, and more about the hearts that watch them. To one, a wandering planet is doom. To another, it is promise. The stars remain unchanged. It is we who wander, searching for meaning in their steady light. The sound came first as thunder, low, rolling, drawn across the sky like a heavy drum. Villagers ran outside, looking up. But some swore it was not thunder. They said it was trumpets, heavenly trumpets, announcing the end. The air vibrated, roof beams shook, dogs howled. And in their fear, people remembered the passages of Scripture, the trumpets of Revelation, the blasts that heralded judgment. Manuscripts in the Vatican's possession record such events, strange sounds in the night, unexplained echoes rolling across valleys. Some wrote of them as storms, others wrote of them as signs. And once they were called signs, panic followed quickly. People gathered in churches, certain that the seventh trumpet had sounded. Confessors heard lines of souls begging for absolution before the morning light. The church learned to weigh these reports carefully. If it was thunder, the fear would fade with the weather. If it was believed to be trumpets, fear lingered long after the sky cleared. Prophecy thrives on sound more than sight. A voice carries deeper into memory than a shadow. One prophecy in the archives warns of 7 blasts across the horizon, each louder than the last. But the accompanying margin note softens it. Storms roll in patterns. Do not mistake them for angels. The note reflects the church's approach. Acknowledge the wonder, but ground it in natural order. People need anchors more than omens. Still, not all thunder was simple. At times, the sounds were real mysteries, rumblings with no storm, echoes with no cause. Modern minds might name them quakes or atmospheric shifts. But in centuries past, they were mysteries too heavy for silence, and prophecy filled the gap. The danger was not only in the sound itself, but in how quickly it spread. A rumour of trumpets in one village could reach 10 more before the next dawn. Each village added details, each listener added meaning. Soon the sound grew from a rumble in the sky to a chorus of angels announcing the final hour. The Vatican kept such prophecies sealed or softened, not because they doubted the sounds, but because they feared the fever of interpretation. Trumpets, or thunder. The question itself was more dangerous than the answer, for once a sound is named a sign, hysteria cannot be recalled. Perhaps the truest meaning is simpler still. Every thunderclap, every echo, every unexplainable sound is a reminder of power beyond human control. Not always doom, sometimes only awe. The end may not be announced by trumpets, but by silence. The danger is in confusing every echo for judgment. That is why the church whispered caution. Thunder is thunder, unless God chooses otherwise. Let us not hurry the end by mishearing the sky. The city woke under a veil of grey. Ash fell softly, like snow, but with a sting in the throat. Windows closed, doors barred, yet still the dust crept in. Fires burned far away, mountains erupting, forests smouldering. But their breath travelled miles, settling on streets, on altars, on the hands of those who prayed. People whispered the word prophecy. Ash on the wind meant judgment. The archives are filled with such accounts. Volcanoes darkened skies in Italy, in Iceland, in far islands across the sea. Each time, fear sharpened. Prophets declared the world aflame. Monks copied visions of fire raining from heaven. Farmers swore their crops failed not from weather but from wrath. Ash turned natural disaster into supernatural sign. The Vatican watched carefully. They knew ash unsettled more than bodies. It unsettled faith. A mass said, under a sky veiled in grey, carried a weight of doom. The Eucharist tasted of smoke. The chalice smelled faintly of fire. People feared they were living through the end described in Revelation. A third of the earth burned, smoke rising. The sun darkened. One manuscript describes ash so thick it blotted the midday Sunday. The writer called it the day without shadows. He marked it as prophecy fulfilled, the end beginning. But the church added a quiet note. The mountain rages, not the heavens. Fear not. That simple line was an attempt to draw people back to reason. Yet reason struggles when skies turn black. Ash carries symbolism too heavy to ignore. It is the dust of death, the sign of Lent, the mark on the forehead reminding all of mortality. When it fell from the sky unbidden, the symbolism deepened. People saw themselves already judged, already burned. Panic was natural, but ash is not only death, it is also renewal. Fields fertilize after fire. Forests grow greener. The church knew this too. Some priests used ash on the wind as sermon fuel, reminding their flocks that even destruction can seed life. One bishop wrote, "The ash that frightens us today will feed the harvest tomorrow." Such words softened fear, turning prophecy into patience. Still, hysteria could not always be calmed. In years when famine followed eruptions, people clung to prophecy. They said the world was ending, not merely suffering cycles of earth. The Vatican often sealed such prophecies, choosing silence rather than fuel. Better the people endure hunger than collapse in despair. Ash on the wind teaches a lesson repeated across ages. The line between natural and supernatural is thin. The sky darkens and humans rush to meaning. The church's burden was to remind them that not every shadow is apocalypse. Not every ash is wrath. Sometimes mountains burn, sometimes forests fall, sometimes creation simply breathes in fire and exhales in grey. But the prophecy lingers, because ash always feels like a whisper of endings. It clings to skin, to clothes, to churches, a reminder that everything returns to dust. The faithful were told, "Remember, you are dust, and to dust you shall return." When ash falls from the heavens, that truth feels louder. The danger is in mistaking reminder for conclusion. So the draws hold visions of ash, storms, and burning skies, not because they were false, but because they were too near, too raw. They tell us something simple, something the church wanted, whispered gently, not shouted. Endings surround us always. Every fire leaves ash. Every life ends in dust. The prophecy is not of the world's destruction, but of its renewal. Ash falls, yes, but from ash, life grows again. The calendar said December. The bells rang Christmas. But the air felt wrong, as if the year itself had refused to close. Days passed, snow melted, spring should have come, but the people whispered that time had stalled. In one monastery record, a scribe wrote, "The year stretches long, as though it will not die." That phrase gave birth to prophecy. The idea of a year that will not end appears in multiple manuscripts, always tied to dread. Some saw it as a sign of judgment suspended, the world held in limbo before collapse. Others said it foretold famine, seasons refusing to turn, harvest lost to endless winter. And still others feared it meant eternal war, a cycle repeating with no dawn of peace. The church read these prophecies with care, for they touched a fear deeper than fire or plague, the fear that suffering has no limit. The Vatican's response was silence, tempered with patience. They taught that years turn not by human reckoning, but by God's. If it seemed endless, it was only perception. Yet perception was enough to break spirits. A farmer who plants in April and reaps nothing by October feels the year has betrayed him. A widow who buries sons in war after war believes time has stopped. These are the years that will not end, the years of sorrow stretched thin across months. One prophecy described a year of 13 moons, a span that refuses closure. The archivist who copied it added in red, "This is allegory. Do not bind God to calendars." But allegory is often forgotten in hunger. When the sky did not shift as expected, when crops failed, when soldiers did not return, people remembered the prophecy more than the warning. They believed they lived in the endless year, the age that would not yield to spring. The church feared despair more than miscalculation. For if people believed time itself betrayed them, what hope remained? That is why such prophecies were sealed. Not because they were false, but because they struck too near the soul. A short famine ends, a short war ends. But an endless year suggests no dawn. That was a darkness heavier than any ash. And yet, hidden within the fear lies another truth. Time does not stall. Seasons turn, even when we cannot see it. What feels endless is often only the soul's exhaustion, not creation's rhythm. The prophecy of the year that would not end speaks less of calendars than of the human heart. It warns us that despair can make any season feel eternal. In that sense, the prophecy is fulfilled each time grief blinds us to dawn. The endless year lives not in the sky, but in us. The church's silence was mercy. They knew the danger of giving despair a name. For once named, it grows. Better to fold the page, seal the drawer, and whisper, instead of resurrection, that all winters end, even those that feel endless. The first streak of light came at dusk, low across the sky, white fire trailing like a sword. A nun wrote in her diary, "It hung there, pointing toward us, and all trembled." Comets have always carried prophecy. They do not move like stars. They flare, vanish, return years or centuries later. Their very strangeness makes them signs, and signs invite fear. In cloisters across Europe, chronicles record the same response. Nuns gathered at windows, monks knelt in courtyards, all eyes fixed on the tail of fire stretching across heaven. Some prayed it was a herald of mercy. Most feared it was a blade. Manuscripts speak of comets as warnings of war, pestilence, the death of kings. The archives are filled with notes. Comets seen, unrest soon followed. Correlation became prophecy. The church walked carefully. Jesuit astronomers charted comets, proving their cycles. They showed Halley's return, predicted paths, explained tales as sunlight on ice. But even knowledge could not quench awe. When fire cuts across the night sky, explanations fall short. People see not science, but omen. One prophecy in the Vatican drawers describes a torch above the cloister burning the world. The scribes hesitated to release it. A torch in heaven is too easy to misread. To nuns, it was a sign of chastity under trial. To villagers, it was the world aflame. Too many meanings, too much fear. So the text was folded, sealed, kept hidden. Yet comets also carried hope. Some saw them as heralds of change, the clearing away of corruption. One abbot preached, "The comet is God's broom, sweeping the sky." For him, it was not doom, but renewal. The church preferred such readings, softening fear with metaphors of cleansing. Still, they never fully silenced the darker voices. Too many wars began under comet skies, too many famines followed. The danger was always hysteria. When comets appeared, markets faltered, rulers trembled, armies stalled. The people demanded answers. And the Vatican often gave none, choosing instead to remind the faithful that signs in heaven are not calendars of doom. But silence breeds rumour, and rumour fills voids quickly. The truth remains. Comets are mirrors. They reflect the state of the soul that watches them. To the fearful, they are swords. To the hopeful, they are brooms. To the weary, they are reminders of the unknown. The church feared that too many would see only the sword, never the broom. That is why the prophecies of comets were kept hidden, not to deny the stars, but to protect the earthbound hearts below. In the end, every comet burns itself away, its fire trailing into darkness. The fear fades too. What remains is the memory of looking up, of wondering whether heaven was speaking. Perhaps it always island. Perhaps the comets are not threats at all, but questions. What do you see when the sky burns? Sword, broom, or something greater? That is the prophecy's real test. The shepherds were the first to see it. At dusk, when clouds rolled low over the fields, they swore a cross appeared in the sky, two beams of light cutting through the mist, shining above them. They fell to their knees. Some wept. Word spread fast. And by morning, half the village was convinced heaven had written its promise in the clouds. Such visions appear often in the archives. Crosses seen in storms, in smoke, in clouds at sunset. Some described them as clear as wood and iron. Others saw only faint lines of light. But once spoken, the image grew. A single cross in the sky became a prophecy of salvation, or judgment, or the end itself. The Vatican was cautious. They knew clouds play tricks, light bends, eyes see what hearts long for. Pareidolia, the scholars might say now. But in the past, every vision of a cross in the sky carried weight. For the faithful, it was confirmation that prophecy breathed among them. For the fearful, it was warning that the last days had begun. One parchment describes a cross of fire above the city, seen by many. The scribes added notes: signs may comfort, but may also deceive. Do not build doctrine from clouds. That was the church's burden, to balance awe with reason. They could not deny what people saw, but they could not let every cloud become apocalypse. Yet some visions endured, too powerful to dismiss. In times of persecution, the cross in the sky became hope. People whispered that Christ himself was near, standing guard over the faithful. In times of war, the same vision became judgment, a reminder of blood on hands. One symbol, many meanings. The church sealed many of these accounts, fearing their power to ignite frenzy. Still, not all were silenced. In some monasteries, the vision was preached carefully, framed as a reminder that God speaks through creation, but never to terrify. A cross in the cloud was not doom, but presence. Not an ending, but a sign of companionship in suffering. The danger, as always, lay in hysteria. A village convinced that heaven had written doom above them might abandon work, abandon order. And so the Vatican whispered caution: believe what you saw, but do not build your life upon it. Clouds shift, light fades. Faith must rest on more than sky. Yet, centuries later, the visions still whisper. People still look up and see shapes in clouds, and some still fall to their knees. The prophecy of the cross in the cloud teaches a truth deeper than its image. The heavens reflect what we carry within. When we long for mercy, we see a promise. When we fear judgment, we see a warning. The cross is not written above us. It is written inside us. The archives hold these visions not as calendars of doom, but as mirrors of longing. The cross in the cloud is not about the sky ending. It is about the heart seeking meaning in mist. The church sealed many such texts because they knew the danger of misplaced trust. But the visions endure. Clouds will always form crosses. Light will always bend. And humanity will always look up, searching for signs. The prophecy asks the same question each time. When you see the cross in the cloud, do you tremble in fear or rest in hope? The answer reveals more about you than about the sky. That is the prophecy's secret, and why it was both feared and cherished. It was bound in plain leather, cracked at the edges, nothing to suggest danger. No jewels on the cover, no golden clasp. Just a book. But when opened, the first thing noticed was not words, it was space. Pages left deliberately blank, margins wide and unfilled. Between lines of text, gaps lingered like swallowed breaths. It looked less like a record of prophecy than a conversation interrupted. The man who wrote it remains unnamed. He called himself only a servant of the word. He spoke less than others, and when he did, his phrases were sparse, clipped. Unlike fiery seers who described visions in torrents, he used silence as language. The Vatican later called him the silent prophet. His writings unnerved because they left more unsaid than said. One entry reads, "I saw the river, and it was bitter." Then, nothing. No explanation, no warning, no resolution. Another, "The city burned." Yet, from its ashes, the sentence ends midline, the page blank afterward. Was it left unfinished or erased? No one knows. That was the danger. Silence begs to be filled, and people filled it with fear. The church feared these fragments most of all. Complete prophecies can be weighed, argued, explained, but gaps invite imagination, and imagination grows wild in shadow. A blank line can become anything: plague, war, famine, and the end. Whole villages built superstitions around these fragments, deciding that the unsaid meant their own doom. Some believed the blanks were deliberate, that the prophet withheld the worst because it was unbearable. Others believed the blanks themselves were prophecy, that silence meant God's voice had withdrawn, leaving humanity to its own ruin. Both interpretations bred unrest, both eroded trust. So the Vatican sealed the book, They copied small portions into safer texts, framing them as allegories, but the whole volume stayed hidden. Archivists wrote notes on its cover, too open, too incomplete, too dangerous. They understood that silence is louder than speech when fear is listening. And yet, the silent prophet still whispers through time. His fragments echo in our own hearts, where fears live unfinished. Every unspoken dread, every half-imagined disaster, we are all writers of blank lines. Perhaps that was his true message, that the greatest prophecies are not what is written, but what the human soul fills in. The danger is not in the book itself, but in us, in the way we hunger for certainty, and when denied it, we write doom with our own trembling hands. The silent prophet forces us to face that truth. That is why his book was sealed, not to deny revelation, but to keep fear from finishing sentences never meant to be completed. The city's skyline was marked by it, stone rising against the heavens, bells swinging above the markets. The tower had stood for centuries, outlasting storms, wars, fires. People said it would never fall, and then one day it did. Not once, but twice. The prophecy is scattered through different manuscripts. Some describe a tower falling, rebuilt, then falling again. Others tell of a tower that refused resurrection. The language varies, but the theme holds. Collapse not once, but repeated. And each collapse shakes not only stone, but faith. The Vatican read these words with deep unease. Towers were not just architecture, they were symbols of order, of stability. A tower falling meant more than rubble. It meant institutions trembling, authority questioned, heaven mocked. To suggest that a tower could fall twice was to suggest that restoration might fail, that trust once broken might never return. That was too dangerous for open preaching. Still, history gave fuel to the prophecy. Fires consumed towers, earthquakes split them, wars toppled them, and each time people whispered, "This is it, the prophecy fulfilled." But when rebuilt towers fell again, fear sharpened. Was this not proof that the words were true? The prophecy seemed to breathe with every stone that cracked. One record tells of a bishop who tried to calm his people by saying, "The tower is stone, not faith. Faith does not fall twice." His words carried some peace, but only for a while. Fear is louder than reassurance. And when towers fall again, people remember prophecy, not sermons. The Vatican sealed many versions of this text. They feared it would be used politically, twisted to accuse leaders, to predict downfall, to erode obedience. A tower falling could mean anything. Rome, the church itself, a king, a city, even the human soul. Its flexibility was its danger. People saw what they wanted, and what they wanted was often doom. But perhaps the prophecy carried another meaning. Towers fall when built too high, when pride forgets humility. To fall twice is to refuse the lesson the first collapse offered. In that reading, the prophecy warns less about stone and more about stubbornness. It is not architecture, but arrogance that falls again and again. That interpretation softens fear, but sharpens responsibility. If towers fall from pride, then each of us carries our own prophecy. Every time we rebuild on the same foundation of vanity, we risk collapse. That is not a prediction, it is a truth. Still, the manuscripts remain sealed, because fear clings faster than wisdom. A tower that falls twice is too vivid, too easily matched to any calamity. Better, the church decided, to let the words rest in silence than to watch them ignite hysteria. Yet they linger, whispered still, because towers always rise, and towers always fall. And somewhere in the human heart, we know the prophecy is not only about stone, it is about us. The parchment is old, its edges brittle, its script hurried. It tells of a night when 3 voices were heard, though no mouth spoke them. They echoed across the city, one like thunder, one like weeping, one like song. The people froze, listening. Some swore it was heaven, others swore it was hell. The prophecy called it the Night of 3 Voices. The Vatican feared this vision because it was impossible to anchor. Thunder, weeping, and song, what do they mean? No explanation is given. Some scribes argued that they were the voices of Father, Son, and Spirit. Others argued they were omens of war, famine, and plague. The ambiguity itself was dangerous. People hear what they expect. Thunder becomes judgment, weeping becomes grief, song becomes false hope or true. One manuscript claims the voices foretold schism, thunder as division, weeping as loss, song as the rise of a false unity. Another claims they foretold resurrection, thunder shaking the grave, weeping turning to joy, song filling the dawn. Both interpretations circulated quietly, both carried weight, but to release them publicly would invite chaos. The Church feared that any crisis could be named the Night of Three Voices, and once named, hysteria spreads. In the margins, one weary scribe left a note. Perhaps the voices are not signs, but mirrors. We hear what we are. That line may hold the deepest truth. Thunder is heard by the fearful, weeping by the grieving, song by the hopeful. One night, one event, but three kinds of hearing. The prophecy is less about what is spoken and more about who listens. The Church chose silence, sealing most copies. They preached instead that God's voice comes in stillness, not confusion. But the prophecy lingered in whispers. People remembered nights when they heard strange echoes in storms, when winds moaned through towers, when bells carried across valleys. And each time they said, "It is the three voices again." Even now the image unsettles. To hear thunder in the sky, to hear weeping in the dark, to hear song where no singer stands, these experiences are too raw to dismiss. They touch something primal, the sense that the world itself speaks. The prophecy magnifies that sense, turning it into dread. But perhaps the voices speak differently. Thunder warns us of power. Weeping reminds us of compassion. Song promises joy. To hear them all together is to remember the fullness of existence, strength, sorrow, beauty. The end is not in the voices themselves, but in how we answer them. The Vatican feared that people would not wait to answer, that they would leap to hysteria, and so they kept the prophecy sealed. Yet it whispers still, because the night of three voices is not bound to parchment. It happens whenever the world speaks louder than men, whenever the wind carries more than weather. The question remains, what voice do you hear? It began with silence. Villagers woke one morning to find the riverbed dry, its stones cracked, its fish gasping in shallow pools left behind. The river that had carried trade, that had watered fields, that had sung through centuries gone. Some said it was drought. Some said it was divine. Everyone said it was prophecy. The Vatican archives hold manuscripts describing such a sign, a river that ceases to flow, its current withheld, its path turned to dust. In Scripture, rivers mark life itself. They water Eden. They flow from Christ's side. They promise healing in Revelation. A river that stops, then, is not merely natural. It is the end of blessing, the silencing of creation. The prophecy called it the day the river forgot its course. One account tells of monks travelling by boat, stranded midstream when the current died. They stepped onto rocks and walked ashore, convinced the world was collapsing. Another describes farmers staring into dust where water had always been, their prayers choked with fear. These stories were repeated, and with each repetition, the river grew into symbol, no longer just water, but the very flow of time itself. The Church feared this vision deeply, for to speak of a river stopping was to invite despair. People depend on rivers not only for food and fields, but for rhythm. A flowing river tells us that life continues. Its sound is reassurance. When that sound ceases, it feels as though God himself has turned away. So the prophecies were sealed, marginal notes softened them. Rivers dry in drought, but return with rain. Do not mistake cycle for conclusion. Yet even such notes could not silence the fear. For the prophecy was not about rivers only. It was about interruption, the breaking of what should never break. One interpretation said the river was faith itself, ceasing to flow in human hearts. Another said it was history, grinding to a halt before the end. The images were too strong, too flexible. They could attach to anything, a famine, a war, even a silence in prayer. That is why the Vatican guarded them. But perhaps the prophecy whispers something else. Rivers do stop. Sometimes they freeze in winter. Sometimes they shift course. Sometimes drought starves them. Yet life adapts. New streams form. Wells are dug. Springs appear. The flow is never truly gone. It is hidden, waiting. The prophecy, then, is not only warning, but invitation. When the river seems to stop, look deeper. Life still flows. It always flows. The archives trembled with fear of rivers that dry. But perhaps the truth is simpler. The river never ends. It only pauses, testing whether we trust its source more than its surface. The prophecy of the stopped river is fulfilled not in nature, but in hearts that lose hope when silence falls. The danger is not dry stones. The danger is forgetting that beneath them water still runs. The parchment is faded, but the story lingers clear. A child, no more than 7 years old, began to speak in his sleep. Night after night, words poured from his lips. Strange words, ancient prayers, fragments of visions. His parents listened in terror. Neighbours gathered at windows, straining to hear. The boy never remembered his words upon waking. Yet what he spoke echoed scriptures, echoed prophecies, long sealed. The archives call it the dream-tongue child. Accounts vary. Some say he warned of famine. Others say he spoke of angels. One transcript records him saying, "The shepherd walks alone, yet carries the flame." Another has him whisper, "3 nights, no light, then dawn returns." These phrases match texts never meant for public ears. How could a child, unlearned, untrained, know them? The Vatican sent priests to listen. Some believed he was inspired, a vessel of revelation. Others feared deception, trickery of spirits. The boy himself, when awake, was ordinary. He played, laughed, stumbled. He knew nothing of the words he spoke in sleep. That mystery unnerved the church more than any fire or flood. A prophecy from parchment could be sealed, but a prophecy from a child's lips, how could that be contained? So the decision was made, silence. The family was moved, hidden in remote countryside. Priests wrote careful reports, filed them deep in drawers. The boy grew, and the gift faded. He became a man like any other, yet his words linger in ink, fragments of sleep tongues that echoed across centuries. The danger was not only in the child's words, but in what they suggested, that prophecy is not confined to scrolls. It can break into ordinary lives, unbidden, uncontrollable. If the faithful believed such gifts could rise anywhere, the authority of the church might fracture. Who decides which dream is true, which whisper is false? To avoid chaos, the Vatican chose to bury the story, but perhaps the lesson was never about the boy alone. Perhaps it was about how truth moves in sleep, in silence, in the mouths of those least expected. The prophecy of the child unsettles not because of what he said, but because of who he was, small, powerless, ordinary. A reminder that God's voice can bypass halls of power, that truth may rise from bedsides rather than cathedrals. The child spoke in sleep, then forgot. We remember only because others wrote it down. And maybe that is the true prophecy, that revelation is not always thunder, but murmurs in dreams, words lost to morning, unless we listen carefully. The Vatican feared the chaos of such voices. Yet they still echo, fragile and haunting, reminding us that prophecy often comes where we least expect it, through the lips of a sleeping child. There is a story in the archives of a city where mirrors multiplied. It began with glassmakers, skilled and proud, crafting reflective panes for nobles. But soon, mirrors appeared everywhere in markets, in chapels, in taverns, streets lined with polished surfaces. People saw themselves at every turn, and with each reflection, prophecy whispered louder. The manuscripts describe it as the city of mirrors. Some called it a blessing light doubled, beauty amplified. Others called it a curse faces multiplied, truth distorted. One account tells of citizens losing sense of self, seeing so many reflections they no longer knew which was real. Another says the mirrors began to crack without cause, splitting faces into shards. The people feared it was a sign. The world itself fracturing. The Vatican read these stories with unease. For the mirror is more than glass. In Scripture it is symbol. We see dimly now, face to face later. To live surrounded by mirrors was to live surrounded by questions of identity, truth, and illusion. Was the prophecy warning of vanity, of falsehood, of a world lost in its own reflection? One sealed parchment describes a vision, a city covered in mirrors, and the people burned by the light of their own gaze. The archivist noted, too near to pride, too near to confusion. They feared that preaching such a prophecy would only inflame paranoia. Every new invention of glass, every polished surface, could be seen as fulfillment. Hysteria would follow, but the image is too powerful to dismiss. A city of mirrors is not only fantasy, it is a symbol of every age when humanity becomes obsessed with its own image, when pride eclipses humility, when reflection replaces truth. Perhaps the prophecy was less about glass than about culture itself, a warning that too much self-regard leads to collapse. Still, the Church chose silence. They sealed the text, filed it away. Yet the idea lingered. Even now, the prophecy feels sharp. We live surrounded by reflections, screens, images, faces, multiplying endlessly. The city of mirrors exists, not in stone streets, but in our daily lives. The prophecy asks a question. What happens when we see ourselves too much, too often? Do we recognize truth, or do we fracture into illusions? The Vatican feared that question, feared the panic it might spark. But perhaps it is the truest warning of all, that the end is not fire, not flood, but obsession with our own reflection until the mirror cracks, and we no longer know who we are. In the margins of an ancient folio lies a drawing unlike the others. No saints, no angels, just a door, tall, narrow, without handle or hinge. Below it, in faded ink, a single phrase, the door without a key. For centuries, readers puzzled over it. Was it allegory, warning, or prophecy of something yet unseen? Accounts from monasteries describe visions of sealed gates appearing in dreams. Pilgrims would walk endless corridors, only to find themselves halted by such a door solid, immovable, offering no entry. Some said it stood for heaven itself, closed to the unready. Others said it represented truth, withheld until the final hour. The ambiguity made it powerful, and power made it dangerous. The Vatican feared how the image might be used. Already in times of famine, preachers would thunder, "The door is closed. Repent before you are locked out forever." Fear spread quickly when such words were spoken. Families rushed to confess, markets emptied, work halted. Panic, not prayer, filled the streets. The door was too easy to weaponize. So the Church sealed the prophecy, marking it only as allegory. Christ is the door. No key is needed but faith. Yet even that interpretation failed to silence unease. What makes the prophecy haunting is its silence. A door without a key is not violent, not fiery, not loud. It simply stands, waiting, indifferent, and that stillness frightens more than thunder. People can endure disaster when action is possible, flee, hide, rebuild, but a locked door gives no path. It paralyzes. One archivist's note reads, "Perhaps the prophecy is not that the door cannot be opened, but that it must be knocked upon." In that reading, the warning is not despair, but invitation. Seek, ask, persist, Yet such subtleties vanish when fear rises. For most, the door meant exclusion, and exclusion breeds hysteria, but perhaps the prophecy is deeper still. Perhaps it does not speak of heaven or doom, but of the human heart. Every soul carries its own locked chamber, a place sealed by wounds, fears, regrets, a door without a key. The prophecy may not warn of cosmic exclusion, but of inner silence. The danger is not that God locks us out, but that we lock ourselves in. Still, the Vatican sealed the words, fearing their misuse, and so the image lingers in shadows, whispered in secret. The door without a key remains unopened, unanswered. Perhaps that is its truest fulfillment. Not a prediction, but a question left standing before us. Will you find the way through, or will you stand forever outside, staring at what you believe cannot be opened? The manuscripts call it the breaking of the circle. In simple ink sketches, circles appear whole, unbroken, perfect. Then cracks drawn through them. Sometimes the circle is split in halves, sometimes shattered into fragments. The accompanying lines are sparse. When the circle breaks, the end is near. Circles have always been sacred. They are symbols of eternity, of unity, of divine perfection. The Eucharist is round. The sun and moon circle the heavens. Even the ring given in marriage is a circle, promising no end. To imagine a circle broken is to imagine eternity, fractured, covenant torn, creation itself undone. The Church treated this prophecy with extreme caution. Preached openly, it could be applied to anything. Wars that split kingdoms, schisms that divided the faithful, even natural disasters that shattered harmony. Every fracture became the breaking of the circle. The danger was not the words themselves, but their infinite reach. Fear would always find a way to claim fulfillment. One parchment describes a vision of the host itself breaking mid-air, not in the priest's hands, but on its own. The faithful gasped, believing the circle of grace itself had fractured. The report was filed quietly, locked away. Such imagery was too raw, too dangerous. To suggest that sacrament itself could break was to risk despair deeper than any famine. Yet the circle is not only perfection, it is also cycle seasons turning, years repeating, generations rising and falling. To break the circle might mean the end of rhythm, the collapse of order. Winter that does not yield to spring, death that does not yield to life. The archives tremble with such fears, but perhaps the prophecy was never meant as doom. Perhaps the breaking of the circle is liberation. A cycle broken means a chain shattered. Suffering does not repeat forever. Oppression does not bind without end. To break the circle may be to end what enslaves. One archivist dared to write in red ink, "If the circle of sin breaks, then comes freedom." That line was never preached aloud, but it remains, hidden in drawers. The truth may be both. To break the circle is to end something. Whether doom or deliverance depends on what circle breaks. The Vatican feared leaving such choice to the people, for fear breeds darker readings. So the prophecy was sealed. And yet the circle breaks every day. Friendships end, nations divide. Even the sun and moon, perfect in their courses, one day will fail. The prophecy, then, is not distant. It is constant. It whispers that nothing is unbreakable but God himself. Everything else, stone, covenant, cycle, circle, can fracture. The question is not if the circle will break, it is how we respond when it does. Do we see only ruin, or do we glimpse renewal? The prophecy does not tell us. It leaves us with fragments, as fragile and unfinished as the circles themselves. There is a manuscript, thin and worn, whose final page contains only one sentence. When the last bell rings, silence shall cover the earth. No elaboration, no date, no detail. Just that single line. It has haunted archivists for centuries. Bells are more than sound. They mark time, hours, days, seasons. They call to prayer, warn of danger, celebrate birth, mourn death. In villages, the bell is the heartbeat of life itself. To imagine a last bell is to imagine time ending, rhythm silenced, heartbeat stopped. The prophecy cuts deeper than fire or flood. It speaks of stillness, absolute. The Vatican feared this text profoundly. If preached, it would haunt every tolling bell. Each peal might be mistaken for the final one. Panic would ripple outward with every sound. So the prophecy was sealed, hidden, whispered only in guarded rooms. Yet whispers spread, and in times of plague, when bells tolled endlessly for the dead, people trembled. Perhaps these are the last. One scribe tried to soften the prophecy, adding in the margin, "The last bell is not doom, but rest. Not silence of death, but silence of peace." Another wrote, "Perhaps the last bell is not rung by us, but for us, calling us into eternity." Yet such reassurances rarely reach the people. Fear always carries louder. The prophecy endures because it touches something primal. We live by sound, the call to work, the cry of children, the toll of bells. Silence unsettles. A world without sound feels like a world without life. To imagine silence blanketing the earth is to imagine absence deeper than death. And yet, silence is also sacred. Monks seek it, mystics treasure it. In silence, God's voice is clearest. Perhaps the last bell is not terror but invitation, the final call into stillness where time ceases and eternity begins. Still, the Vatican sealed the words. They knew people cling to fear more easily than to peace. They knew that once a prophecy is spoken, every bell becomes suspect. Better to keep silence hidden than to let fear grow louder than faith. But bells will ring until they do not. And one day there will be a last, not of doom, but of completion, not of despair, but of fulfillment. The prophecy asks us not to tremble, but to listen to hear in every bell the reminder that time is precious, finite, fleeting. Each toll is one closer to the end, but also one more chance to live, to love, to believe. The last bell will ring. That much is certain. What it means, doom or peace, remains unwritten. The prophecy leaves the choice to us. Silence will come. What fills it depends on the lives we live before the sound fades. The prophecy speaks of a crown not lost, not stolen, but shattered. Gold splintered into fragments, jewels scattered across stone floors. It is not a crown toppled from a king's head in battle, but one broken by unseen force, as if authority itself crumbled. The image is stark, unforgettable. Power undone, glory fractured, majesty reduced to shards. The manuscripts that describe this vision are careful, but their margins tremble with caution. For crowns mean more than ornaments. They represent kingdoms, rulers, the very order of society. To prophesy a crown shattered is to prophesy collapse of rule, disintegration of authority. And in times of unrest, such words can topple more swiftly than armies. That is why the Vatican chose silence. One account tells of a vision where the crown was lifted high in a cathedral, light glimmering upon it. Then, without warning, it cracked like thin glass. The fragments fell, each piece reflecting light differently. The people in the vision wept, not because the crown was gone, but because it could never be whole again. That was the terror. Authority might be restored after war, rebuilt after rebellion, but shattered gold does not mend. The interpretation was debated in whispers. Some said it foretold the collapse of monarchies. Others said it meant the church itself, its authority fractured by division. A few dared to suggest it was the crown of creation, human dominion over the earth, shattering under the weight of its own pride. Each reading carried danger, each could ignite unrest. The prophecy's imagery spread nonetheless. Villagers whispered it when rulers fell ill. Merchants repeated it during famines. Soldiers remembered it before battle. The shattered crown became shorthand for fragility, that no power is permanent, no authority unbreakable. That was what the Vatican feared most, for if the faithful believed crowns could shatter, would they still obey? And yet, perhaps the prophecy is mercy disguised. A crown that shatters may free those crushed beneath its weight. When power breaks, space opens for renewal. When authority collapses, humility can enter. The prophecy does not say the shards remain useless. They glitter still, each reflecting light in new ways. Perhaps the true message is that no single head can bear all weight forever. Authority shared among many may shine brighter than a single crown ever did. Still, the Vatican sealed the text, too dangerous to preach, better to guard order than to invite unrest. Yet, the prophecy lingers. Crowns have fallen across history, and each time, fragments glimmer. The crown shatters, and we are reminded, power is not eternal, glory is fragile, and authority, no matter how divine it claims to be, is always one crack away from dust. A parchment preserved in fragile condition describes a night when stars fell like shards of glass, not one or two meteors streaking across the sky, but multitudes, thousands, tens of thousands, falling until the heavens looked broken. The witnesses wrote in awe. It was as though the firmament itself cracked, spilling its fire upon the earth. Astronomers today might call it a meteor storm, but to the people who saw it, it was prophecy embodied. The stars, symbols of eternity, breaking apart, raining down like shattered glass. The manuscripts call it the night of glass stars, and even centuries later, the phrase chills. The Vatican approached these accounts with dread. A star falling is one thing Scripture mentions it. People expect it. But countless stars falling at once? That speaks of heaven unraveling. It suggests not a sign, but collapse. Such imagery, preached in villages, would drive people into frenzy. Work abandoned, prayers screamed, despair overwhelming. So the records were sealed, yet copies remained. In rural parishes, whispers spread. Some swore their ancestors had seen it, the night sky ablaze, light scattering like fire across oceans. Others claimed to have dreamed of it, waking in terror. The prophecy grew beyond parchment into legend, a tale parents told in hushed tones, children repeated in fear. One archivist tried to soften the vision. He wrote in the margin, "Stars do not fall. They appear so, but remain fixed. Fear not illusion, but fear listens poorly to reason. When light streaks in multitudes across the sky, awe silences logic. People see heavens breaking, not illusions of orbit. And perhaps awe is the point. A night of glass stars does not need to signal doom. It may be reminder instead that even the sky is fragile, that eternity is not ours to command. The prophecy may not warn of destruction, but of perspective. What we assume unchanging can shift in an instant. What we think eternal may reveal its fragility in fire. Still, the Vatican feared such words. Fragility invites panic, so they silence the prophecy. Yet the stars fall regardless, and storms of meteors still grace the night sky. Each time, the prophecy breathes again. Glass stars scatter across darkness, and people wonder if this is the night spoken of. The truth may be this: every falling star is a shard of eternity, reminding us of transience. They fall not to terrify, but to teach. Light is fleeting, life is brief, beauty burns, then vanishes. The prophecy of glass stars is not about apocalypse. It is about remembering the preciousness of every spark before it fades into dark. The last of these three prophecies speaks not of sky or crown, but of earth. It tells of a tomb hidden beneath stone, sealed not by accident, but by intent. The manuscript describes it simply: a tomb not opened, a body not named, waiting for the end. What body, what name? Silence answers. That silence frightened the Vatican most of all. Whispers spread quickly when fragments of this prophecy escaped. Some believed it foretold the discovery of a body never meant to be found, perhaps an apostle, perhaps even Christ himself. Others thought it spoke of a tomb holding a secret text, a revelation sealed in stone. The lack of detail made it fertile ground for imagination, and imagination birthed fear. One report tells of peasants digging near ruins. Convinced they had found the hidden tomb, they unearthed bones, ordinary and unnamed, but declared them proof of prophecy. Panic followed. If the hidden tomb was real, what truth did it hold? Would it unmake faith? Would it reveal the end? Such questions shook communities. The church had no choice but to silence them. In the archives, marginal notes offer interpretations. One scribe writes, "The hidden tomb is the heart of man, sealed by pride, unopened until judgment." Another writes, "It is the church itself, carrying truth it dares not reveal." These readings shift the prophecy from literal to symbolic, but the danger remains. For a symbol too easily mistaken for fact breeds hysteria. The idea of a hidden tomb unsettles because it suggests incompleteness. Death is meant to end with burial and closure. A tomb left unopened implies unfinished story, secrets withheld. Humanity fears unfinished stories. They gnaw at us, whisper of betrayal, hint at truths too terrible to speak. The Vatican sealed the prophecy for this reason. To suggest that something essential lay buried and hidden would undermine trust. Better to let the faithful believe all is revealed than to stir hunger for secrets. Yet the prophecy persists. Every time ruins are uncovered, every time bones are found, whispers rise. Perhaps this is the hidden tomb. And so the vision lives, not because of stone and earth, but because of human longing. We want closure, we want certainty. The prophecy denies both. Perhaps that is its true purpose, not to announce discovery, but to remind us that mystery remains, that not all will be revealed. That faith demands trust in what is unseen, in what is still buried. The hidden tomb may never open. And perhaps it should not, for faith without mystery becomes certainty, and certainty leaves no room for awe. The prophecy lingers because it names our deepest tension, the hunger for answers and the necessity of trust. A hidden tomb unsettles because it reminds us we do not know everything. And maybe the end will come not with trumpets or fire, but with silence, with a door that remains closed, with a tomb that never opens. The Vatican sealed the words to prevent hysteria, but their silence only confirms the truth. There are things still buried, things still hidden, things we are not yet ready to see. The hidden tomb remains, both in earth and in us, waiting for the day it will either be revealed or remain forever closed. The prophecy begins with a contradiction. A sun, but not radiant. A sun that rises, yet gives no warmth, no light, only shadow. Manuscripts describe it as a black sun, a sphere that darkens the sky instead of brightening it. Witnesses claimed it turned noon into twilight, crops into dust, and prayer into trembling silence. Astronomers might call it eclipse, a simple passing of moon before light. But to the people who lived beneath such darkness, it was no simple event. Eclipses lasted minutes. The black sun, they said, lingered for days, even weeks. Fields withered, birds fell silent, children wept at the sight of their own breath in midday air. It felt not like passing shadow, but like the very heart of creation extinguished. The Vatican feared this vision more than most. The sun is more than light. It is rhythm, order, promise. To speak of its darkening was to speak of all stability unravelling. And so the manuscripts that told of it were sealed, marked too near despair. For what is faith if even the sun fails? Still, stories spread. Farmers told of winters that came too soon, of skies veiled in ash from distant mountains, of fields left barren under dim skies. Each time, they whispered, the black sun has risen. Fear grew not from proof but from memory, from the sense that darkness too deep could return without warning. One parchment describes a vision where the host itself turned black during Mass, its roundness echoing the darkened sun above. The faithful fell to their knees, some in terror, some in awe. The priest, shaken, said only, "This is a mystery too heavy for us to bear." That Mass was never repeated. The story was written down only once, then locked away. The image endures because it is primal. A world without light is a world unmade. The prophecy of the Black Sun is not only about eclipses, or ash or famine. It is about the terror of abandonment, the fear that God's light itself could vanish. That is why the Church silenced it. To speak such dread aloud is to risk despair deeper than any hunger. Yet perhaps the prophecy is not doom but metaphor. A black sun may not mean the sky at all, but the human soul meant to shine, yet dimmed by pride, hatred, despair. The prophecy may not warn of cosmic collapse, but of interior eclipse. We become black suns when our hearts radiate not light but shadow. The Vatican sealed the words to shield the faithful, but perhaps we need them. For the black sun does not only terrify, it warns, it reminds. Light must be guarded, nourished, kept alive. When hearts grow cold, when compassion dims, when hope fades, the sun darkens within us, long before it darkens above. That is the truest danger. Not skies collapsing, but souls extinguished. The black sun rises whenever love fails. And prophecy whispers, it can be prevented. If we choose light, if we tend it, if we refuse to let our hearts eclipse themselves. The manuscript begins with rhythm. 1 shadow, then 2, 3 shadows, then 4, 5, 6, and at last 7. Then silence. It does not explain what these shadows are, only that they fall in sequence, each darker than the last, until the world lies beneath 7 veils of gloom. Scribes argued endlessly over the meaning. Some said the shadows were wars, each heavier than the one before. Others said plagues, each crueler. A few suggested the shadows were not events at all, but ages, eras of increasing despair leading to final silence. None agreed, all feared. The Vatican hesitated to release the prophecy because its ambiguity was dangerous. People could apply the 7 shadows to any sequence of misfortune. 7 years of famine, 7 kings fallen, 7 storms. Once spoken, the prophecy would never end, because people would always count shadows until they reached 7. Better, the Church decided, to leave the text sealed, marked too easy to misuse. Yet fragments escaped. Villages repeated it during hardship. When 2 bad harvests came in a row, they said, "That is 2 shadows, 5 more to come." When war followed plague, they counted again. 3 shadows now. The prophecy gave shape to despair, rhythm to suffering. It spread not because it was true, but because it made pain predictable. People would rather number their sorrows than believe them endless. One account describes a monk who claimed to see the shadows in visions. He said they appeared as cloaked figures, each taller than the last, each carrying a burden. The 7th bore silence itself. When asked what came after, the monk said, "Only, nothing, for there is no 8th shadow." He was silenced by his superiors, his words locked away with the manuscripts. But perhaps the prophecy is not meant to terrify. Perhaps the 7 shadows are stages of purification, each veil stripping away illusions until truth stands bare. Darkness can be a teacher, silence a gift. 7 shadows may not be destruction, but preparation, the end of noise, the beginning of stillness. The archives feared the prophecy because it was too open, too adaptable, but its endurance suggests it touches something deep. We all count shadows, illness, loss, betrayal, fear. We number our sufferings, wonder how many more must come before dawn. The prophecy names that experience. It does not explain it. It does not resolve it. It simply says, there are shadows, and they come in sequence. The hope lies in this. The prophecy does not end with destruction. It ends with silence. And silence is not nothing. It is rest. It is waiting. It is space for something new to emerge. The 7 shadows fall, yes, but after them comes quiet, and perhaps in that quiet light returns. In a locked drawer of the archives lies a parchment unlike the rest. Not black ink on faded vellum, but letters written in red as if traced in flame. The archivists called it the Scroll of Fire. They handled it rarely, fearing even to touch it, for the words seemed to glow faintly in candlelight. The prophecy describes a scroll descending from heaven, its edges burning, its words alive. When opened, it does not reveal blessing but judgment. The first lines read, "The words themselves shall burn, and those who hear them shall tremble." The rest continues in fragments, warnings of cities consumed, kings undone, oceans boiling. It reads less like scripture and more like thunder. The Vatican sealed it immediately. For if such words were read aloud in villages, panic would ignite like dry straw. Fire is too vivid, too contagious. And when prophecy itself takes the form of flame, its danger doubles. The scroll of fire could not be entrusted to preachers. It was hidden, copied only once, then buried under layers of caution. Yet whispers spread, as they always do. Some claimed to have seen the scroll in visions, letters glowing in dream. Others said fragments were read aloud in secret gatherings. Fueling sects convinced the end was near. The prophecy became more dangerous in silence than it would have been in speech, for rumour burns faster than parchment. One interpretation suggests the scroll of fire is not literal at all. It is the human conscience, burning with truth too sharp to ignore. When read, it exposes every falsehood, consumes every excuse. The fire is not destruction, but purification. That reading is hopeful, even beautiful. But few embrace it. Fear clings to fire more than hope does. The imagery unsettles because it touches something primal. Words are meant to guide, to comfort, to heal. Fire is meant to warm, to cleanse. But when words themselves burn, when fire itself writes, the boundary collapses. Truth becomes unbearable. Guidance becomes judgment. That is what frightens. The prophecy lingers still, because fire is always near. In war, in famine, in the ash of cities, we see the scroll unrolled again. Words burn, truth blazes, and people tremble. The Vatican feared to unleash it, because once spoken, flame cannot be contained. But perhaps it was never meant to be contained. For fire destroys, yes, but it also clears. It burns away chaff, leaving wheat. It scorches fields, so that soil may renew. The scroll of fire may not announce doom, but transformation. Words that burn are words that change. The prophecy, then, is both terror and hope. It depends not on the scroll itself, but on the reader. Will we fear the flame, or will we let it purify? That is the choice the prophecy offers. That is why it was sealed. And that is why it still waits, glowing quietly in shadows until the day it is read again. The manuscripts describe a city that built a tower, not for bells, nor for watchmen, nor for glory, but for silence. It rose above the streets, higher than the roofs, higher than the markets, its stone smooth, its windows narrow. At its top, nothing rang, nothing shone, only stillness. The prophecy called it the Tower of Silence. Accounts differ. Some say the tower was real, constructed by a sect of monks who vowed never to speak. They climbed its steps each dawn, stood at its heights, and offered no chant, no hymn, only mute gazes toward the horizon. Others say it was a vision, not stone but dream, a tower seen only by prophets who wrote of its haunting quiet. Either way, the meaning unsettled the church, for towers usually speak. They carry bells, they shout warnings, they ring in feasts. A tower that silences instead of speaks is inversion, a denial of purpose. That was what frightened the Vatican most. If the prophecy spread, people might come to believe that silence itself was command, that God's voice had ceased, that prayers echoed into nothing. Such despair would erode faith faster than plague. One parchment records a vision of crowds gathering beneath the tower, waiting for sound. Hours passed, then days. No bell, no cry, only stillness. At last the people dispersed, convinced heaven itself had turned away. The archivist's note beside it is brief. This is too dangerous. Silence breeds doubt faster than fire. And so the pages were sealed. Yet silence is not always absence. Some mystics saw the prophecy differently. They claimed the tower was not doom but gift, for in silence God is clearest. A tower of silence is a tower of listening, not abandonment. They wrote, "When the tower ceases to ring, the soul may finally hear." But such nuance was fragile. Preached poorly, it became terror instead of comfort. The prophecy persists because silence unsettles us. We expect noise bells, sermons, voices. When it is withheld, we panic. The Tower of Silence names that panic, gives it form, warns that one day sound may cease, but it also offers hope. For perhaps when noise dies, truth begins. The church feared to release the prophecy because it left too much room for interpretation. People would either despair or turn to dangerous mysticism. Better to seal it than to risk either. Yet, the tower stands still, if not in stone, then in imagination. We each carry it inside us, the place where words end, where silence waits. The prophecy asks, when you climb that tower, will you hear nothing or will you hear everything? The prophecy tells of a mark, not of ink, not of scar, but of ash. It appears on foreheads, on hands, on doors. Some marks deliberate, placed by ritual. Others sudden, unbidden, left by unseen hand. The manuscripts call it the mark of ash, and its presence divides. Some marked, some unmarked, some spared, some doomed. The Vatican treated this prophecy with extraordinary caution, for its imagery too closely mirrored rituals already sacred. Ash is used in penance, in Lent, in remembrance of mortality. To speak of ash as mark of doom was to risk corrupting what was meant for hope. The line between sacrament and terror would blur. So the prophecy was hidden, marked too near to holy practice. Yet the stories could not be erased. Villagers told of nights when ash fell from the sky after fires, leaving grey streaks across skin and homes. They whispered, "The mark has come." Priests tried to reassure, calling it dust, calling it chance. But prophecy thrives on fear, not reassurance. And so the mark lingered in imagination, always waiting to return. One manuscript describes a vision of crowds marked unwillingly. They woke to find grey smears across their brows, as if placed by unseen hand. Some wept in terror, convinced it meant death. Others claimed it was protection, a sign of salvation. That was the danger, the ambiguity. No one knew whether the mark saved or condemned. The uncertainty itself was poison. The archives contain interpretations. Some scribes wrote that the mark represented conscience ash as reminder of mortality, dividing those who live aware from those who live blind. Others claimed it was warning of persecution, when faith would be branded as curse rather than blessing, but none could agree. The mark defied meaning, and its very vagueness gave it power. Perhaps the prophecy's truth is simpler. Ash is what remains after fire. To carry the mark of ash is to carry survival, to live after burning. The mark does not doom but testify, I endured, I remain. Seen this way, the prophecy is not curse, but witness. Yet such gentleness rarely endures in rumour. People prefer terror, and so the mark of ash became symbol of division, of doom, of end. The Vatican silenced it, fearing chaos. Yet every Lent, when ash was pressed upon brows, whispers returned. Was this ritual blessing or prophecy's curse? The two could not be untangled. The mark of ash remains, fragile as dust, enduring as fear. It asks a question, each time it appears. Does this mark condemn you, or does it save you? The answer lies not in the ash, but in the heart that bears it. The manuscripts tell of a sea that was not water. Its waves did not move, its depths did not shift. It lay flat, unbroken, gleaming like crystal. The prophecy calls it the sea of glass. To those who saw it in visions, it was both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because it reflected heaven perfectly. Terrible because it did not move, did not breathe. A sea without life. Scribes struggled to explain. Some said it was heaven itself, pure and untouchable. Others said it was earth's oceans, frozen, stilled in judgment. A few whispered it was death, the final stillness, when movement ceases and reflection alone remains. The ambiguity frightened the Vatican. Too easily it could breed despair. And so the prophecy was sealed, marked too near eternity. One account tells of a fisherman who dreamed of walking to shore and finding the sea solid beneath his feet. He stepped onto it, expecting collapse, but it held him like stone. Around him fish lay embedded, suspended in glass, eyes wide, bodies frozen mid-swim. He woke screaming, for to him the sea's stillness was not peace but suffocation. The vision spread, terrifying his village, until priests silenced it. Another manuscript tells the prophecy differently. The sea of glass was not judgment but promise. It was calm beyond storm, rest beyond struggle. A surface unbroken, where no ship sank, where no wave drowned. In that reading, the sea was heaven, the eternal calm after chaos. But the Vatican dared not preach it. For peace and despair looked too similar, and people confused one for the other. The imagery haunts because seas are meant to move. They roar, they foam, they rage. To imagine one stilled is to imagine nature unmade. The prophecy touches something primal, the fear of lifelessness, the dread of frozen silence. But it also whispers of longing, the hope for calm, for stillness, for final rest. Perhaps that is the prophecy's heart. The sea of glass is not doom or salvation, it is both. It is the end of motion, which can be terror or peace depending on how one arrives. To the restless, it is suffocation. To the weary, it is rest. The Vatican sealed it because it could not be controlled. Preached poorly, it would drive some to despair, others to reckless longing. Better to leave it silent. Yet the prophecy lingers. For every time waves crash, storms rage, people dream of calm seas, perfect and still. And every time silence falls too heavy, people fear the same stillness as death. The sea of glass waits, whether as judgment or gift. Its surface reflects us perfectly. And prophecy whispers, what you see in its reflection is what you carry within. Terror or peace, despair or hope, it is your own soul mirrored in its stillness. That is why the vision endures, that is why it was hidden, and that is why it still speaks. The prophecy begins not with war, nor with fire, but with a garden, not barren desert, not lifeless stone, an orchard once filled with fruit, once alive with blossom. The manuscripts describe rows of trees stretching toward the horizon, but in the vision, every branch bends under weight of rot. Leaves curl, fruit shrivels, bark splits, as though the life within had fled. It is called the Garden of Withered Trees. The Church read these lines with unease, for the garden is sacred. From Eden to Gethsemane, it holds the language of beginnings and endings. To imagine all gardens withering was to imagine hope itself desiccated. The Vatican sealed the prophecy, marking it as too near despair, for fear that its preaching would extinguish the last spark in weary hearts. One manuscript tells of a monk who dreamed of walking through such a garden. He reached for fruit, but it turned to dust in his palm. He touched a trunk, but bark crumbled like ash beneath his hand. At last, he fell to his knees, unable to tell whether he was in orchard or graveyard. His brothers recorded his words, but their abbot locked them away. To him, the vision was too heavy for human bearing. Another account whispers that the trees were not ordinary but symbolic. each tree a soul, each branch a life. Their withering signified not famine but faith gone dry, a people no longer rooted. The archivist who copied the text left a note. Perhaps the prophecy is not doom but warning. Water the roots, or they will die. Yet nuance rarely spreads. Fear does. The image unsettles because it is quiet. No thunder, no fire. Only slow death, silent decay. That is harder to resist than catastrophe. A storm passes, a battle ends. But a garden withers day by day, unseen until it is too late. The prophecy names that dread, the slow fading of what should endure, and yet perhaps it is also mercy. For a withered garden can be replanted. Soil may be renewed, seeds sown again. The prophecy does not say the garden burns, only that it withers. Withering can be reversed. It warns us not to abandon hope, but to tend what is dying before it collapses entirely. The Vatican feared such words because they could be misused, preached as condemnation, better silence than despair. But the prophecy lingers still, because every orchard faces winter. Every tree endures seasons of barrenness. The garden of withered trees is not a vision of apocalypse alone. It is a reminder of neglect. And a reminder that even in withering, the possibility of renewal waits if only the roots are tended before they crumble into dust. Few prophecies struck terror like this one. It describes a river that runs not with water, but with blood, its current thick, its smell heavy, its waves staining the banks red. Witnesses in vision wept as they wrote. It rose higher each day, until the earth itself seemed drowned in flesh. It is called the River of Blood. The Vatican feared its effect. Blood already marked too many chapters of history, wars that spilled it, martyrs who shed it, plagues that drained it. To prophesy an entire river of it was to blend all horrors into one unbearable image. And so the words were locked away, filed under too near hysteria. The manuscripts vary. Some describe the river flowing from wounds of the earth, as though creation itself bled. Others say it poured from the sins of men, each drop a lie, a betrayal, a murder. One parchment claims the river rose until it reached the doors of cathedrals, lapping at their thresholds as if to drown even the sacred. That page was nearly burned by archivists, preserved only in fragments. And yet, not all interpretations were despair. One scribe wrote in trembling hand, "Perhaps this is not doom but redemption. For blood cleanses, blood redeems. The river may be baptism, washing the world in scarlet grace." His words were not widely accepted, yet they remain, fragile as hope in the midst of dread. The image persists because it strikes deep. Rivers sustain life, but rivers also carry death. To imagine one turned entirely to blood is to imagine abundance turned to corruption. It unsettles because it inverts trust. Water quenches thirst, blood does not. To drink from a river of blood is to swallow horror itself. Yet, perhaps, the prophecy warns us less of skies and more of hearts. For we have already filled rivers with blood through wars, through greed, through hatred. Perhaps the vision is not future at all, but mirror, a reminder that every conflict, every slaughter already stains the waters. The prophecy may not predict doom so much as reveal it. The river is already red, if only we dare to see it. The Vatican sealed it, fearing despair. But sealing cannot erase truth. Blood flows, whether in rivers or in memory. The prophecy lingers because it names what we wish to deny, that violence always collects, always rises, until it drowns even the innocent. Yet the prophecy leaves room for choice. If the river flows from sin, then repentance may dry its course. If it rises from neglect, then compassion may cleanse it. The river of blood warns, but it also pleads. Change before its current consumes all. That is why it was hidden, and that is why it still waits, red and silent, in the depths of the archives. Among the sealed texts, lies a vision of a sword, bright, sharp, forged for battle. But in the prophecy it is broken, not by enemy strike, not by rust, but by unseen hand. Snapped clean across the middle, its pieces lying apart. It is called the broken sword. The church debated this vision endlessly. A sword broken might mean peace, the end of war, the silencing of conflict. Or it might mean weakness, the failure of defense, the collapse of protection. Which interpretation was true? No one could agree. That ambiguity made the prophecy dangerous. If preached, it could spark either despair or rebellion. So it was sealed. One parchment describes a knight who dreamed of such a sword. He lifted it to fight, but it shattered in his grip, leaving him defenseless. He awoke trembling, convinced it foretold not peace, but ruin. Another account tells of a priest who saw the sword breaking as a dove descended, peace replacing violence. Both visions were preserved, but never resolved. The broken sword unsettles, because it cuts both ways. To those who rely on strength, it is terror, their power undone. To those who long for peace, it is promise the end of bloodshed. The prophecy refuses to choose. It holds both, and that tension is its power. Archivists argued the symbolism. Some said the sword was empire, fractured beyond repair. Others said it was faith, divided by schism. A few whispered it was humanity itself, broken under the weight of pride. Each interpretation fit, none satisfied. The prophecy remained like the sword itself, split, incomplete, sharp, even in fragments. And perhaps that is its point. A sword broken is not useless. Its pieces still cut, still pierce. Brokenness is not the end of danger. Sometimes it multiplies it. Fragments wound more than whole edges. The prophecy may warn that division itself can become weapon, sharper than unity ever was. Yet perhaps it whispers something gentler, for when a sword breaks, it can be reforged. Fire reshapes metal, hammer renews purpose. The prophecy may not announce finality, but invitation, to forge anew, not in violence, but in peace. The Vatican silenced it, fearing misuse. Kings might twist it into omen of war, rebels into banner of uprising, priests into sermon of despair. Better to leave it hidden, but hidden words do not vanish. They linger, waiting to be rediscovered. The broken sword remains in imagination, both fear and hope. Fear that our defences may fail. Hope that our violence may end. Its prophecy lies not in the blade itself, but in the hands that hold it. Do we mourn its breaking, or do we rejoice? Do we forge it again for battle, or do we melt it down into ploughshares? The prophecy does not answer. It leaves the choice to us. That is what unsettles most of all.